we're trying to go live. So, as I'm getting this ready here, I just want to welcome you with us. I think tonight's going to be a great show. It's more than a show, We've got lots of things that we really want to talk about. I think you're going to hear some things that might make you really, really think. And truthfully, that's what this is all about. So we want to welcome you here with us to the Gospel Truth. Again, my name is John Watson. I am awful blurry. Let me see if I can reset this camera here, and maybe that'll help. I don't know. Sometimes it does. But I'm the preacher at the Westside Church of Christ in Indianapolis, Indiana. You're welcome to come visit us. We would certainly love to have you with us. And there it is. It's looking better already. Certainly love to have you come and be with us and worship with us in spirit and in truth. We're located at 2675 Kentucky Avenue. That's Indianapolis, Indiana, 46221. Also, you can contact me. You can send me a message through Facebook. I'm John Watson, the preacher at the Westside Church of Christ on Facebook. And YouTube's not, haven't figured that one out for messages yet, but either way, you can try it, and hopefully I'll figure out how to get that. But you can also email me, which I don't see this a lot, so it might be, email has become snail mail anymore, but it's wfas@sbcglobal.net, and you can email me there. And I'll do my very best to answer questions as much as I possibly can. But it's really difficult. I'll just be honest with you. It's pretty difficult sometimes to get to all those questions. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about the Judgment Day, the Day of Judgment. Oh, I need to transition this. So there we go. So this Judgment Day is something that I think a lot of people just are completely and totally. Hi, Bobby Allison. Great to see you. Completely and totally misinformed on. They think Judgment Day is something like the old song, when I woke up this morning, I could have swore it was the Judgment Day or something like that. The sky was all purple. There were people running everywhere. Tried to run from my destruction. You know I didn't even care. That's an old Prince song. I don't remember how the words go. I'm getting old. So anyway, but that's what people really think Judgment Day is. In the churches of Christ, we teach, well, I don't anymore. I used to. But the churches of Christ teach the amillennial position. Here's essentially what they teach about Judgment Day, which is it's kind of sad, really, because it shouldn't be that way. I want to say hey to Keith and hey to Rick. Glad to see you all with us here tonight. The churches of Christ generally teach that everything will just go along as it is. I don't teach this, mind you, but this is how I was raised. And then all of a sudden, bam, there you go. Christ, the sky rolls back, the trumpet sounds. Oh, not in that order. Trumpet sounds, the sky rolls back. Jesus is standing on a cloud, floating downward. And then all of a sudden, bodies pop out of the grave. And they're changed back to a physical body. And then they are raised up into the sky and changed back into a spiritual body, like they were just a few moments before they were changed into a physical body. And then, so they've got a rapture. They don't teach that, but that's what they've got. And then they've got, where'd I leave off? And then judgment. Everybody stands in a line, I guess, and waits to step up to the bar on high, kind of deal. And they're looking to give account of themselves from the before the judgment seat of Christ. And then at some point when all this is taking place, and whether it's before the judgment, before every last person gives an account, or after, I don't know. I was never really clear on that. Then somehow the earth explodes and it's just totally annihilated. And that's essentially what the Church of Christ teaches. Now, let me point something out for all of you, all yuns in the Church of Christ. It's no different than what the premillennials teach. Just talk to someone who's Pentecostal, Church of God, Baptist, whatever, and this is pretty much what they teach. It's just a little bit of a twist. I'm sorry. Now, here's something else. In the churches of Christ, we have come to very much pride ourselves on the fact that we're the only ones that are right about the Judgment Day and about end time events. And then, on top of that, they deny premillennialism. Well, here's a fun fact for you. Up until the 40s and 50s and so forth, the Church of Christ was predominantly premillennial in their teachings. They were dispensational. And let me say something about this. And it wasn't until Foy Wallace did his work and had some pretty serious debates that took place that it changed those things. So, hi Teresa, hi Tim, great to see you all with us. So it changed those things. Foy Wallace, preacher in the Church of Christ, very powerful preacher too. He saw a lot of the same things that I did. Now, Foy was born probably, I don't know, 60, 70 years before I was. 60 years, I don't know how old he was. I was born in the late 60s, so he would have been, born in the 20s maybe or something like that. The teens, I don't know. But so here he is, this preacher in the Church of Christ, and he's just really getting down in the mud, and he's saying, listen, we've got it wrong. And he's teaching the people in the Church of Christ that their dispensational viewpoint is wrong, and he showed them why. And he came awful close to many of the things that I believe. And I'd never heard of Foy Wallace, by the way, until I had come to the conclusion that I was wrong about eschatology. Now, this idea of eschatology, or the study of end times, there are some things that are extremely clear in the scriptures that are very difficult to understand. One of them is, and we've come to understand this in the churches of Christ, one of these things that is extremely clear but very difficult to understand is the idea of baptism. It's right there. It is illustrated time and time and time again. How many times just in the book of Acts? How many times is it repeated throughout the New Testament? How many, and this is something most people in the Church of Christ don't even know, but how many Old Testament prophecies are there about water baptism in the New Covenant? Well, it's there and it's so very clear. Here, let me give you an illustration. And a lot of people will say, well, this isn't actually in the Bible. Well, yes, it is actually, and I believe it's legit. But Mark 16, verse 16, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. And people want to say, oh, well, that's not water baptism. If it's not water baptism, then why was everybody water baptized? And they did it immediately, and they didn't wait for the baptismal service on the first quarter of each, or on the first Sunday of each quarter or something like that. Wait, why? Because it's very clear, and they understood it in the first century. Well, try to teach baptism to somebody today, and most people they just totally reject you out of hand. Oh, no, all you got to do is believe. Really, where did that work out for anybody in the New Testament? But this is not the topic here tonight. But I'm trying to use this as an illustration. Now, there's another passage that is extremely clear. Now, listen to this. This is Matthew 16. I'm going to talk about the Judgment Day. I'm going to show you what Judgment Day is from a scriptural standpoint. So in Matthew chapter 16, here's one of those extremely clear passages, right? That is very difficult to understand. Now, the reason it's difficult to understand is because 99.7%, the same rate as COVID, of people in this world are taught one certain thing, and that's all they will ever believe. They will never change. Or maybe it's not that high, but they will never change, because they're not willing to put in the time and the effort to study and to see what is actually there. That's one of the things I love so much about the churches of Christ. Generally speaking, they have the attitude, or at least they say they do, not everybody does, but at least they say they do, that they're willing to study things out. Now, my experience as of late has proven them wrong, but we'll just go with that for now so I don't waste too much time on that. Exactly. Amen, David Stambursky. And Ben Shepherd, good to see you too. And I'm going to keep going. So here's another passage that is extremely clear. Matthew 16 and verse 28. Listen to this. Sorry, I've been fighting allergies all day. This happens to me a lot. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, the traditional explanation, especially as of late, has come to say, well, what this actually means is that, well, this is the day of Pentecost. This is the day of Pentecost? Did they see Jesus? Did he come in his kingdom on the day of Pentecost? Did they see Jesus coming in his kingdom on the day of Pentecost? Now, we could illustrate from other passages that this term kingdom is used synonymously with glory. Now, notice verse 27. In verse 27, the Son of Man is about to, that is the Greek word mello, in the present indicative active. And what this means is this is in process at the time that the speaker was writing. Okay, so this is in process. So let me read this again. The Son of Man is, my version says going to, the Greek says and should be translated, and many literal translations translate it as about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. Now, verse 27 is talking without question about, and I've never had anyone that I've spoken to in the churches of Christ disagree with the fact that verse 27 is talking about Judgment Day. Now listen to this. He says the Son of Man, my New American Standard says, is going to, they cheaped out. They didn't translate it correctly because they injected their paradigm. Now, what if you had been from birth been taught that this verse says the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father, and you employed audience relevance? Who was it written to? How did they understand it? You would think differently than you do today, I promise you, if the translators would have been honest with the translations. Instead, what they did was inject their thoughts into their religious paradigms, their religious training into these things. So just because somebody's a scholar does not mean they are correct. Now, let me read it again. Matthew 16, verse 27, the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Those two verses are saying the exact same thing. The traditional explanation from my brethren in the Church of Christ is that verse 28 is teaching that this is the day of Pentecost. I got to ask, did they see Jesus coming in his kingdom on the day of Pentecost? No, they did not. What we have employed here is the use of Hebrew parallelism. You got to remember, these guys are Jews. They think as Jews, they speak as Jews, they write as Jews. Hebrew. And they use Hebrew parallelism. They'll say this, and then they'll come back and say this. Let me give you a good example. Mark 16:16. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Parallel. He who does not believe shall be condemned. Did you get it? So verse 27 and verse 28 is the same concept, the same tool, literary tool. So he says that judgment is about to happen. The angels are going to come, and every man is going to be recorded to his deeds. Then he says, you guys are going to, some of you standing here will see me coming in my kingdom. If this is the day of Pentecost, why is it that only one of them had died at that point? And really just about 50 days earlier, roughly. So the language doesn't fit. He says there'll be some still alive. Not all of you, not most of you, some of you. We all get that language. So if Judgment Day happened and the world didn't explode and blow up and everybody standing in a line at the judgment seat of Christ and give an account of themselves, then what happened? That's what we want to discuss during the remainder of our time here together tonight. Let me put it this way. Judgment Day is not what we were taught. It's not. I can tell you this. There are people that are outside of religion. Atheists, government officials. That's probably the same thing, really. But anyway, that are outside of religion, and they want to keep you confused about things. Don't think for a second that that's just some conspiracy theory or whatever. It's not. They want you to be confused. Matter of fact, they want to tell you what to believe when it comes to the scriptures. Am I wrong about that? I know that I'm not. I see it all the time. All you got to do is open your eyes and you can see that there are people, every time you turn on the television, you listen to one of these religious stations. Let me point something out. If you like to listen to contemporary Christian music, I'm not going to say there's necessarily anything wrong with that. I have my own opinions on that, but let's go with it this way. And you're getting into the music. First off, you're buying into something modern that was not intended in the New Testament. Just saying that. But so you're getting into the music and you're getting into the beat and you're just loving the message. And they teach you a concept that cannot be found in the scriptures, and they inject that into your head with a good beat. It's really not good. So there are lots of people trying to get us to believe things that are not correct. Jesus plainly said, there are some standing here who will see me coming in my kingdom. That's what he said. I don't know how to get around that. That was a tough one for me, but I did. And when I realized, hey, my training in the Church of Christ has taught me that wherever the scriptures lead, I will follow. I'm telling you, people, this is where the scriptures lead. But one of the difficulties that I had was the day of judgment. Well, what is that? I had to learn what the scriptures teach about the day of judgment. And the simplest way to understand the day of judgment is to look at the scriptures in a couple ways, okay? First off, we have to rightly divide the scriptures. We get that. Paul told Timothy that. Rightly divide the scriptures. Earnestly, diligently study. That's the idea, okay? Give diligence to those things. Now, you can't give diligence to those things if all you're doing is listening to another man and never opening your Bible and never digging in. And one of the things you're going to have to do is look at the words that they used and try to figure out how they used it and what it means. And I know it's not easy, but it is what we're commanded to do. Remember in Ephesians 3, Paul said, you can understand by reading what I wrote. And he told that to the brethren at Ephesus. And the scriptures are written on their level. Believe it or not, it's written on their level. There's some difficult things. There's no question about that. Peter even admitted that in 2 Peter 3. But it was written on their level, on their educational level, on the average intelligence of mankind. And it can be understood. So Paul said, whereby when you read, you can understand my knowledge into the mystery of Christ, the mystery of the church, and what the church's responsibility is, and its eternal responsibility. Now, if the church has a responsibility, which we know is to evangelize, this is just kind of a sidebar. So the church has an eternal responsibility to evangelize. How can they do that if there's no more people left to evangelize? You think about that. In other words, what that means is the church is eternal, which is what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 3. And in verse 21 in Ephesians chapter 3, it says, world without end. Look that up in your King James. Did they get it wrong? I don't think they did. I think they understood the meaning of the Greekish phrase there. What I mean by Greekish is that these guys spoke Greek. They were Hellenized, no question about that, but they were still Hebrew. So they may use Greek words with Hebrew meanings. Now, Judgment Day. Let's go to Matthew chapter 25. This is where everybody wants to go, and this is actually a question that comes to me often, and came to me like last week. So I was going to just answer back quickly to this individual. But I thought, no, I want to do this and kind of give this, and I'm still not going to be able to do this justice in an hour. But I want to give this some time, okay? So in Matthew chapter 25, beginning in verse 31, it says, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne and all the nations will be gathered before him. Okay? He will separate them one from another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. By the way, who's on the left? The goats. Just saying. Anyway, so what we get and what we understand from Matthew 25 traditionally is that this is talking about the final day of earth. Let me take a sip real quick. It's the final day of earth. Well, where does it say that? It doesn't say that anywhere. And as a matter of fact, we cannot separate chapter 25 from chapter 24. So notice this. I'm going to show you why this works. I'm going to show you a couple of what we call constituent elements between one of the verses that we just already looked at and another one we haven't looked at just yet. But we're going to show you those and how they're equal, how they uses the same language, how it's talking about the same thing. And we're going to show you the time frame here. So just bear with me. So we have to establish the timing of this. Now, if we look at Matthew chapter 24, let me read something to you. Does this sound like what we just read? At least something similar, right? You ready for this? Verse 29, Matthew 24, verse 29. Now tell me what this sounds like. Does this not sound like what I just read in Matthew 25, starting at verse 31? Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Does that not sound like, very much like, what we just read in Matthew 25? Listen to this, verse 31. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another, and as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on the right and goats on the left. And then when you go through verse 34 through the end, which we don't really have time to do that, you realize that it talks about him and his kingdom, being the king, being the ruler. He talks about telling them that they now can inherit the kingdom. This is in just in verse 34. That was prepared for them from the foundation of the world, and so on. There is no question among just about anyone who cares about the scriptures that Matthew chapter 25, verse 31, is talking about the day of judgment, when the Lord comes on the cloud with his angels. Isn't this what it says in Matthew chapter 24 that we just read this? The Son of Man is coming on the clouds with these angels to gather his elect from the four winds. That's resurrection language. That's exactly what Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31 said. Now, listen to this. You've got these constituent elements, right, between the two. Matthew chapter 24, verse 29 through 31. And then you've got Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 through the end of the chapter. Notice something that you're not going to be taught by just about anybody other than those who are really looking into the scriptures. Ready for this? He was talking to them in their lifetime, these things taking place. Go back to Matthew chapter 24. In verse 32, remember we just read about him coming on the clouds with these angels for judgment and resurrection, right? Learn what happens when Jesus comes on the clouds with these angels for judgment and resurrection. That's the day of judgment, right? Verse 32 says, learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender, it puts forth its leaves. You know that summer is near. Listen to this. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. What does that mean? He is near, right at the door. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. That's exactly what Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 16. Remember, we were reading there from 27 and 28. Some standing here, this generation, will not pass away until all these things take place. And what did he say in chapter 24 and verse 34? This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. It's the same concept. See, the problem is we have been taught pretty much all of our lives that, well, Jesus never really talked about his second coming And here's one I love. Oh, the Old Testament doesn't prophesy the second coming of Christ. It doesn't? You got to be kidding me. Isaiah 40, Isaiah 24 and 25, 26, 27. Okay, so this second coming is all over the place. As a matter of fact, it's in Genesis, Genesis 49, I think it is. So the point of it is, we've just been taught wrong. How did they believe? When we read the scriptures, what did they believe? It becomes very clear in the New Testament that these inspired writers taught that Jesus was coming in their lifetime. Coming back. Okay, this is after he ascended into heaven. They taught he was coming back in their lifetime. Now, that's pretty heavy stuff. Because it's not like we were taught. It's not how we were taught. But that's what Jesus taught. Then you see that you have, man, where do I start? You have the apostles teaching the exact same things. Turn to James. This is James chapter 5. Okay, so here's what I want to show you. Go back to Matthew chapter 24. And remember in verse 33, he says, so you too, when you see all these things, recognize he is near, right at the door. Should be plural, doors, I think. Okay? He's right at the door. This is what Jesus taught. Now, if you look at Mark's account, Mark chapter 13, you're going to see Peter, James, John, and I think it was Andrew, were there. They were the ones asking the question. So we know that James was there. So when you go over to James chapter 5, what was James teaching? Was James teaching that Jesus was going to return somewhere beyond their generation? Listen to this. Verse 7. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it. This is Joel chapter 2. This is what Peter preached on the day of Pentecost, by the way. Anyway, the farmer is patient, being patient about it until it gets the early and the late rains. You too be patient. Who is the you that he's talking to? It's not us. It's not me. It was the people that he was writing to in the first century. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Now listen to this. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. What was Matthew 24 talking about? Judgment. So that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. I didn't make this up. I just read it to you. That is some serious stuff. But you know what? Here's how I look at it. I would much rather stand in opposition to men in the truth than I would stand in fellowship with men outside of the truth. That's what they did in the first century. It's what we have to do today. We have no other choice. We simply have no other choice. If I was the only person left on this earth that believed the truth, I'm not going to change just to please somebody else. Because the truth is precious. Here's how precious the truth is. God gave his son, Yeshua, his Hebrew name, Yeshua. That's how precious the truth is. Now, if James taught the exact same thing that Jesus taught in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24, and Jesus taught the exact same thing at least twice. Actually, it's a whole lot more than that in the Olivet Discourse. Both before the transition verse and after the supposed transition verse of verse 36. Then why would we say that he was teaching two different things? Well, he's using the same language to explain two different things, because in verse 36 it talks about that day. Really, it does talk about that day. Well, let's look at this verse 36. Okay, this is the day of judgment we're talking about. I have so many things I want to say. We're running out of time. But I have to do this, okay? Because I have to dispel the erroneous teaching that Jesus was talking about multiple concepts and multiple questions. The apostles asked him, look at this. In verse 3, he was, verse 20, chapter 24, verse 3 of Matthew. He was sitting on the Mount of Olives, and his disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? What were they asking about? Listen to this. What were they asking about in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3? Are you ready for this? They were talking about the things that Jesus said in verse 36 of chapter 23. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So what's the antecedent to their question? What are they referring to? All of the things that would happen in this generation. And Jesus reaffirms that in verse 34 of chapter 24 when he says, yes, these things are going to happen in this generation. The coming of the Son of Man on the clouds with these angels for resurrection and judgment. That's what he talks about in Matthew chapter 24 and 29. And he says it's going to happen in their generation. But in verse 36, the people who are trying, how do we say this? I don't think, some of them are not trying to distort the truth, but they do. So it's an honest mistake. Many of them have seen it and then can't accept it. So now it's no longer an honest mistake. It's an intentional misrepresentation of what Jesus said. Now let's look at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. You will never in a blue million years understand this passage without understanding the Old Testament. So what does it mean? Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. What's the heaven and earth that is being referred to in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35? That's the old covenant system. He just told you what it was in verse 34. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. The judgment happens at the end of the age. Everybody knows that. But it's not the age that you or I would like to impose upon it. It's the age of prophecy that prophecy imposed. And Jesus makes this very clear when the end of this age is. Listen to this. This is Matthew chapter 13. This all has to do with judgment. I'm going to show you who this was and how judgment affects us, so don't leave. We still got 25 minutes. So in Matthew chapter 13, here is what we see. Ready for this? All right, so this is Matthew chapter 13. He said in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 41, the Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. What on earth is he talking about? Well, here again, if you don't have a working knowledge of the Old Testament, you will never, ever be able to figure this out. What we start doing when we don't have the information to plug in here is we start plugging in our own information and what we've been taught and what we think and what we extrapolate. And that is a huge problem because it generally is going to lead us to the wrong conclusion, which it obviously has. Let's back up. So he's talking about these tares being explained. And in the parable of the sower earlier in the chapter, got the sower, then the tares among the wheat, and the question comes, well, should we go out and pull the tares? And in verse 30 it says, allow both to grow together until the harvest. Well, when is the harvest? At the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, and gather the wheat into my barn. Then he uses the mustard seed analogy, parable. He says the kingdom starts small and then it grows big. And when it's finally big enough, then the birds of the air can come and rest and find rest in its branches. Now, he says the kingdom of heaven is compared to this. Can you find rest for your soul? Yes or no? Can you do that in Jesus? You better believe you can, but not unless the kingdom of heaven is fully mature. And I know a lot of you going, well, that's no big deal. It is a big deal if you're from the amillennial position, or if you believe that heaven has not been opened for some reason. I believe heaven has been opened. When you die, you go to heaven. My soul, for lack of a better way to put this, is with Christ. Think about this. If I'm buried in baptism with Christ, Galatians 3:26 and 27 teaches that when that happens, you're clothed in Christ. Ephesians 2 says that because of that, essentially, we are seated with Christ in the heavenly. How is that possible? It's possible because this is what Judgment Day brought about. It brought about salvation. Now, a lot of people teach, well, heaven's not opened yet. Then you're teaching that there's no salvation. You're teaching that there's nothing different from the Old Testament and what was happening under the Old Covenant to keep you away from God in sending you to Hades or Sheol when you die to wait for the Judgment Day. If that's the case, and nothing is different from the Old Testament, then how was Jesus victorious? What did he do? Somebody's going to have to answer that one. How was he victorious if you still have to wait to be with your Father for the last 2,000 years? I think I'm going to just say it. Jesus was victorious. He opened heaven, and now when you die, physically die, you experience heaven now, not in 10 million millennia when he finally decides to come. And the reason I say that is because if you look at, we're still in Matthew chapter 13. Now, remember what we just read here. He talks about the kingdom, the harvest, at the end of the age. Look at verse 37. The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. As for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age. The end of what age? The end of the age that he was living in. Paul proclaimed, I think it was Paul, that this present and evil age. If this was the gospel age, why would he call it the present evil age? So, Matthew chapter 13, where we read from 41, the Son of Man will send his angels and so forth, is a quote from Daniel chapter 12. This is why I said, if you can't understand, if you don't have a working knowledge of the Old Testament, some of these concepts, you're just going to come to the wrong conclusions when you read some of these things. So Daniel chapter 12, listen to this. Back in Matthew, I lost my place. Back in Matthew chapter 13, he uses these elements from Daniel chapter 12. The Son of Man will send forth his angels. They will gather out of the kingdom all stumbling blocks, those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth, this is verse 43, as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. When you hear this phrase or see the phrase, he who has ears, let him hear, he's saying, listen, you can get this. And here's how you get this. He said, go back and read Daniel. When they quote an Old Testament source, you need to go back and study the context of it. Daniel chapter 12. Matter of fact, all of Daniel, there is nothing in Daniel, no prophecy in Daniel is fulfilled after the first century. Every single prophecy in Daniel is slated and scheduled to be fulfilled at the time of the Fourth Empire. That's the Roman Empire. Now listen to this. This is Daniel chapter 12. This is the quote from Jesus in Matthew chapter 12 or 13 and verse 43. Listen to this. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. So what is this? What's he talking about? Jesus quoted this in all of that discourse. He said, let the reader understand, or Matthew did, let the reader understand. And then Jesus said, Daniel said this. And he quotes this from Daniel. There'll be a time of distress such as never occurred before. And then Jesus adds, never will. He's a prophet, and now he can say, here's what's going to happen. And it will never happen again. So the official position for most in the Church of Christ and some in the denominational world is that Matthew chapter 24, 1 through 34 is regarding the destruction of Jerusalem. So you got the resurrection taking place during the destruction of Jerusalem. I agree with you. But it doesn't change anyway at verse 36. Back to Daniel 12, verse 2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. This is the judgment day. This is at the time when the distress that will never happen again takes place. Jesus said that was the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus quoted Daniel. Jesus talked about the resurrection taking place at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, not in a future sense. You see, the premillennialists get it, that the resurrection takes place when Jerusalem is destroyed. They just have it being rebuilt and a new temple being rebuilt and Jesus coming and reigning for 1,000 years, either before or after the tribulation, or they can't figure that out. They'll never figure it out because that's not what the Bible teaches. So anyway, look at verse 3. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Now listen to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 43. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun, or the brightness in the expanse. It's the sun. Is there any other brightness in the expanse? You want to call it the moon? Really? Anyway, so he's quoting it. In the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Here's what Jesus was teaching the end of the age. He said, by going back and using Daniel 12, the first 3 verses as a proof that the resurrection and judgment and his second coming will take place at the end of the age, which is earmarked by the destruction of the temple in 70. That's everything that Jesus pointed out in Matthew chapter 24 and 25. Now, let's go back to Matthew, since we're kind of basing our study off of this. So in Matthew chapter 24, in verse 36, I think Bobby pointed out here in the comments that the idea here is peri day, but of that day and hour. I'm not even going to go there, okay? So let's talk about this. What is the antecedent? What is this pointing to? What day was he talking about? Was that verse 35? Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away? Yeah. But is verse 35, is it tied to verse 34? You see the paragraph split there? Somebody thought it was. Or is it tied to verse 36? Or is there no transition? And it's all talking about the same thing. Now he says of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Here again, he's quoting an Old Testament verse. That day, this day when the judgment and resurrection takes place, he quotes Zechariah chapter 14. We're not done. We're getting close, but we're not done yet. So Zechariah chapter 14 is his quote. Ready for that? Ready for this? Look at verse, Zechariah 12, 13, and 14. About 20 times, I think it is. It's referred to in that day. So, but, by the way, is a conjunction in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 36. but is a conjunction. And they say, oh, well, it's a transitive conjunction. Really? It's a conjunction. It's tying these two things together. Remember, if you're anywhere close to my age, you'll remember conjunction, junction, what's your function? Hooking up cars and trains and blah, blah, whatever else. Okay, there, you get it. But I want to show you Zechariah chapter 14. The day and hour was not known because they were in birth pains. That's exactly right, Holger. A woman knows the general time frame of her child's birth without knowing the day and the hour. Matthew 24 and verse 8. See, another proof. Holger gets it. You should too. Zechariah 14, I'm going to get to this. There's too much here, and I'm running out of time. Look at the latter part of verse 5. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Is there any question what day this is? When does Jesus come with all of his angels? Jude 14:15 is pretty clear about that. Matthew chapter 24, 27 through 31, very clear about that. Very clear about that. Now listen in verse 6, Zechariah 14 and verse 6. This is what Jesus was quoting about the day of judgment. Remember, you cannot separate the coming of the Lord, the second coming of the Lord. You cannot separate it from judgment day and resurrection. You cannot separate those things. Everybody knows that. Zechariah 14 and verse 6. In that day there will be no light. The luminaries will dwindle. Well, wait a minute. Didn't we read that somewhere in Matthew 24? Yes, we did. For it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but it will come about that at evening time there will be no light. Now, you might say, oh, well, that's way too cryptic. Well, this isn't. Look at the next verse. And in that day, what day? The day when the Lord comes with all his holy ones. This is the second coming, by the way. So tell me there's no prophecies in the Old Testament about the second coming. This is crazy. This is the day when the Lord comes with his angels, when there's no light, the luminaries dwindle, and it's a unique day. And in verse 8, in that day, no question when that is, living waters will flow out of Jerusalem. When do the living waters flow out of Jerusalem? It's not at the coming of the Lord in our future. It was at the second coming of the Lord in the past. Otherwise, you're going to teach what the Church of Christ teaches in eschatology, that there's no salvation. They don't have salvation today because apparently they don't think that living waters flowed out of Jerusalem yet. See how mixed up they are? Now, this concept of judgment that is taking place. Let me go a little further here. I knew this would happen. I knew I'd run out of time. This concept here in Zechariah 14, I just have to throw this in because if you don't understand the 7 feasts, then you're going to miss way too much. Remember, all of the New Testament writers thought Hebraically. Yes, I know. What about Luke? You say, well, yes, I know. Fine. He still thought Hebraically. Okay? He was taught to think Hebrew. This is the way God thinks. This is the way the Holy Spirit directed them. That's how they wrote. That's how they talked. Now, in the 7 feasts, there was one day, only one of all the 7 feasts, that came unexpected, or they didn't know when it was going to come. Hey, Bill Evans, good to see you. And that was the Feast of Atonement. All right. So they didn't know when this was going to take place. So those last 3 feasts, they're all 21 days essentially, and then there was an extra time period at the end of all that, the 8th day celebration, where they all partied it up because they had forgiveness. Now, they had to look for the new moon. So they didn't know when this would be. And it would come after all of the lights in the sky, the moon, for example, dwindled. And then, just as you saw the very first crescent, that's the first day of the month. Well, all of the other feasts are prescribed a day to start on, except that one, and it starts on the first day of the month. So what Jesus is saying here in Matthew chapter 24, in verse 36, he is using the illustration of Zechariah 14 to illustrate that all of these things are going to happen in their lifetime. How many times does he have to say it? Well, let me show you this. He will say this about judgment taking place several more times after verse 36 in their lifetime. You ready for this? In verse 37, for the coming of the Son of Man will be just like in the days of Noah. How was it just like in the days of Noah? It's judgment. Think about this. 1 Peter chapter 3 clearly teaches and illustrates what Jesus is illustrating here. Now, I'll show you this. So, I'm telling you right now, we're going to go over time. I'm going to try to keep this simple, though. So he says it's going to be just like in the days of Noah. So the coming of the Son of Man will be just like in the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. So he says it's going to be just like in the days of Noah. Now, in 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter verbally illustrates what this people being taken means. So let me show you this. 1 Peter chapter 3. If I can get over here. I've got to get a new Bible. This one's just had it. I think I've had this for like, I don't know, 25 years or so. Anyway, 1 Peter chapter 3. Now listen to this. Verse 19, in which he also went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who were once disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah. So here, Peter, isn't this amazing? Peter stood there listening to Jesus give his speech at the Olivet Discourse, his speech on Mount Olivet. And amazing. He talks about it, refers to it a lot. Anyway, so here's what Peter says, verse 20, whose patience, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Now, here's what he does. He illustrates what Jesus was talking about, those some taken and some left. The ones who were taken were the ones who had judgment pronounced upon them. Go back to Noah, right? So the ones who were taken away were the ones who were taken in the flood. They died. But the ones who were left were those 8 souls that were saved through the agency of the water. You can't tell me that water baptism has nothing to do with our salvation. It had to do with the salvation of those 8 people who were left, and it destroyed those who refused it, which was pretty much everybody else. Not pretty much, it was everybody else in the whole world at the time of Noah. Now, Peter uses that illustration to prove what Jesus was saying, that these things would take place when? In their generation. They would see these things. But this isn't the only time that Jesus says judgment is going to take place in your lifetime. I promise you, I will not stop until I show you who this was talking about and how it applies to us today. I just won't be able to do a whole lot of justice to it because I'll cram it all together. Now, in Matthew, back to Matthew chapter 25. Listen to this, verse 42. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken up. For this reason, you too must be ready. Who is he talking to? Audience relevance. It was them. Secondly, did the good man of the house believe that the thief would come thousands of years later? Or did Jesus use an illustration that applied to the lifetime of the people there? It applied to the lifetime of those people. Notice verse 45. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master puts in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Okay. So the master puts the slave in charge of things and then comes back in that slave's lifetime. Does anybody see any irony here other than me? Huh. This event was to take place in the lifetime of the slave, the one who is expecting the return of the master. What about the 10 virgins? So the kingdom, I left some stuff out about the slave, but you get the point, I hope. So then you got the kingdom of heaven to be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were prudent. For when the foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the prudent took oil in flasks along with their lamps. Now while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. Now wait a minute. Did any of these virgins, these are young girls, by the way. They're probably just very young, maybe 12. So did they expect the bridegroom to come in their lifetime? If you were a Jew in the first century and you understood the wedding practices, you would have got this picture. You can get this picture today because a bride today expects her bridegroom to come in her lifetime. This is no revelation. Might be to you, but it really shouldn't be because it's right there in front of us. All we got to do is see it. Then at midnight, after they had fallen asleep, there was a shout. Behold, here comes the bridegroom in their lifetime. What about the parable of the talents? For just like a man about to go on a journey, he who called his own slaves and entrusted them with his possessions to them, and he gave the talents and so on. Listen to this in verse 19. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled his accounts with them. How long was the long time? In their lifetime. There's not one single illustration anywhere in Matthew 23, 24, and 25 that puts the coming of the Lord anywhere beyond their lifetime. We're talking about the second coming. We're talking about the second coming of the Lord on the clouds kind of deal. We're talking about Judgment Day. We're talking about resurrection. So there you have it in the parable of the talents. Well, what about, maybe there's a transition verse in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, wait a minute. I want to show you something. You've got the Son of Man coming in his glory in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 34. And then you got the Son of Man coming in his glory in Matthew chapter 24, starting at about verse 26, at least. Really, it's the whole chapter. Another Jewish literary tool is called an inclusio. You say one thing here, and then you restate it again a little while later, and everything in between there, guess what? Is talking about the same thing. Here's another good example. In Revelation chapter 1, the time for all of these events to take place is soon. In Revelation chapter 22, the time for all these events to take place is what? Soon. So everything in between Revelation 1 and Revelation 22 is to take place when? Soon in their lifetime. Isn't that what he told the 7 churches? I'm getting ready to come. Not some special coming to them. He was getting ready to come for judgment. So there is nothing in the Olivet Discourse, nothing in any of the Old Testament passages that we've looked at, nothing anywhere in the Bible that puts the day of judgment in our future. It was in their lifetime. And if we try to steal that from them, we're taking something away from the Word of God. Plain and simple. Okay, so who did this involve? I think that it's clear that all men everywhere, well, it's clear now to me, that all men everywhere were judged, okay, at the day of judgment. We've established when this was in their lifetime. We have come to the conclusion through what we've looked at here tonight, that it occurred at the time of the destruction of the temple in 70. It's not that the temple falling caused it. It's the temple falling signified that the events were completed. Okay? Now, Um, in Daniel chapter 12, recall what Daniel said in the first couple of verses, first 3 verses actually. He said, and I quote, well, just look. He says, the time of distress in verse 1, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone is found written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will be awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. So here's what you've got. You've got people sleeping in the dust of the ground. They were waiting in Sheol because Isaiah 59 verses 1 and 2 teaches very clear that they were separated from God because of their sins. Well, that's how they were separated. In life, they were kicked out of Eden, and Eden had to be restored. In death, they couldn't be in heaven because of sin until the sin problem was taken care of. Now, when the sin problem was taken care of, that means now you can be with God in heaven. That's pretty simple. So it talks about the just and the unjust, just as Jesus quoted again in John chapter 5. So this is the who. Now, I think all men were affected by this. I'll tell you why. I'll break that down a little bit here just a second. But in John chapter 5, here's what we got to see. Look at verse 28. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs, all this is Daniel 12, the first 3 verses. All who are in the tombs will hear his voice and will come forth. Those who did good deeds to a resurrection of life, those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. Okay, judgment is a bad thing for the people who are taken. Right? Judgment is a bad thing. But for the people who are left alone, the judgment does not come upon them. The wrath of God does not come upon them. So when was this to take place? At the time of the destruction of the temple in 70. That's when it all culminated. So Jesus here is drawing again off of Old Testament scripture. Boy, we could really go into a lot here too. But we have to see that. So that's Daniel chapter 12. Now, the interesting thing about this is it was more specifically on Israel. Now, follow this chain of logic. So judgment was coming upon Israel. I'm just going to say this quickly because I know I lose people when it gets past an hour. Judgment was coming upon Israel. They were to take the gospel to Israel first. Then the mystery that we spoke of earlier in our session tonight from Ephesians chapter 2, the mystery was adding the Gentiles in. That was the mystery because the Jews thought, this would never happen. They just apparently didn't pay attention. But the Gentiles were added in. But why were the Gentiles not part of Israel? Because they were already judged, essentially. Go back in your minds to Babel. This is when God takes, in Genesis chapter 10, these 70 nations, and he scatters them and confuses their language. They were judged. This is where God says, fine, I'm sick of y'all. And then what happened to them when they died? Those people who did not, for lack of a better way to put this is just a simple way, for the ones who weren't good, the ones who weren't worthy in the Old Testament, what happened to them? Well, Jesus, I think, reveals it in Luke 16 with the rich man and Lazarus. They went to the same place that the rich man did, to the place where they were being tormented. So that was according to Romans chapter 4, where, I think it's Romans 4 and verse 5. Let me look here. Where death reigned from, nope, that's not Romans 4. Let me think here. Death reigned from Adam to Moses. Oh, I hate it when I try to think on the fly like this. Well, anyway, it's in Romans. Maybe somebody can clue me into that while I'm still trying to think of all these things. Anyway, Paul taught that death reigned from Adam till Moses. Now, this wasn't that it wasn't that it was physical death. If it was physical death, then once the law of Moses ended, nobody would physically die. So it can't be that. Romans 5. Yes, Romans 5. See, all I had to do is turn my page and it's right there. Verse 12. Just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, so that death spread to all men because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there's no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses. Thank you, Bobby. It's just too easy to get in the middle of things, and it was right there in front of me. So death reigned from Adam until Moses. It's not physical death. The reason it only reigned through the end of the age of Moses is because it was defeated. It was destroyed. That was Hades, Sheol, the separation was destroyed. So essentially, you've got Deuteronomy 32 speaks to this coming upon them in their latter generations, in their later years. So this is the judgment that's taking place. There's a whole lot more to that, and I know I'm just kind of giving you a really small thumbnail sketch of this. But so how were they judged then? Well, you have these nations that had sprang out of Abraham. So this is the Abrahamic promise, right? So they sprang out of Abraham, and God's prophecy came true. They were like the sands of the seashore kind of deal. So these were the ones that were being judged. Now, so why did the law come in, by the way? They went for 430 years from Abraham to Moses without a written law. It came in because of transgression. Everything that happened with Hagar and all that stuff was an illustration. You just got to read Galatians. It was this illustration of that the people who were not acceptable and the people who were. So you've got these Jews who had become, as Josephus put it, the most corrupt, and he agreed with Deuteronomy chapter 32. They'd become the most corrupt generation of Jews ever. Now, when I'm talking about corrupt, I mean they were overtly out in the open, sinful, wrong, bad, evil, rotten, crooked, sexually immoral in every way you can possibly imagine. That's one of the reasons that it's often, these sexual sins that you see condemned in the New Testament, Galatians and so forth, that's kind of the first thing that they address, is because these Hebrew-minded people had become so corrupt in the first century. This is when judgment was coming upon them and the whole world, but upon them specifically. And I'll explain in just a second about how it's the whole world. So you've got the whole world being judged along with the Jews. They were being judged. They were being punished. Their punishment was coming upon them. But it was at the end of the age. Remember, we read this in Matthew 13. This was at the end of the age when you had the wheat and the tares together. Now it makes a little more sense, doesn't it? So you have the wheat and the tares planted together, and Jesus said, well, to leave them alone until the end of the age. Then they'll be separated. That's Matthew 25, 31 and following. They're going to be separated. The righteous from the unrighteous. The end of the age is not in our future. It's already happened. Which we went over that a little bit earlier. So how did this take place? Well, when Hades was destroyed, matter of fact, let me go back to John chapter 5. So in John chapter 5, notice what he says here. This is what Jesus says. In verse 25, truly I say to you, an hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. So he said this is taking place now. That's not in our future, by the way, guys. For just as the Father has life in himself, even so he gave to the Son also to have life in himself. And he gave him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming, listen to this, in which all who are in the tombs or graves will hear his voice. By the way, They want to make the argument that they see this as individual tombs, and they're going to come out physically just like Jesus did. I got news for you. If you think Jesus came out of the grave physically without first coming out of Sheol spiritually, you don't believe what Peter taught on it in 1 Peter chapter 3, starting, I think, verse 18 and 19. Sorry. Not my fault. Anyway, where did I leave off? So don't marvel at this, verse 28. For an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and will come forth, those who did good deeds to a resurrection of life, and those who committed evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. Okay, so what is this resurrection of judgment? This is super, super, super simple. Are you ready for this? Look at verse 24. He had just said this. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes him who sent me, listen to this, has eternal life and does not come into judgment, but is passed out of death into life. Okay, Jesus was teaching what is going to last for all of eternity. If you believe in him, you do not pass into judgment. You've passed out of death into life. This is exactly what Paul was teaching in Romans chapter 7. Oh, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? That's exactly what he was teaching. Paul was united in his teachings with Jesus. Well, if you don't like that one, how about this one? Look at John chapter 3. We read John chapter 3, but we miss the point. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Now, the world here, I think he's talking about Israel. Obviously, 2 Peter 3:9 teaches that God doesn't want anybody to perish. But in more specifically, here's what he's talking about. He's telling these Hebrews that judgment's coming upon them for their evil deeds, and you better get right. And he loves Israel. We know that. All we got to do is study, right? He loves Israel. He loves the Jews. He loves Abraham. He loves Moses and the promises, and he was keeping those promises. Now, listen to this. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Look up the word perish. To destroy to the uttermost. And he actually explains to us what it means. What does it mean to be thrown into the lake of fire? Think about this. Throw a piece of wood into a fire. Does it last forever? No, it takes some time to be consumed. That's the picture. But look at perish. This is the idea of judgment and salvation. Let me read it again. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. If you believe in him, you will not be judged. Isn't that what we just read in John 5? But it doesn't end there. Listen to this. For verse 17, John 3. For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. He who believes in him is not judged. He who does not believe in him has been judged already. I didn't make it up. I just read the words of Jesus. If you don't believe in him, you're judged already. What does that mean? You are dead. That's what this is talking about. That's the judgment that's occurring even yet today. If you do not believe in Jesus, there's a whole lot more than just giving mental assent, by the way, to believing in Jesus. You're dead. You are dead. Let me keep reading this. He who does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of Jesus. This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light for fear that his evil deeds will be exposed. This is classic of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders in Jesus' time. It's just amazing. Okay, so what about, is this the only thing? Okay, people want to say, well, they want to know, well, what happens today? Okay, here's the way this works. Hades has been destroyed. I'm going to show you that in just a minute, then we're going to close. But Hades has been destroyed. So if Hades is destroyed and your soul doesn't go to Hades to wait judgment day because it's already happened and the coming of the Lord has already happened, then what happens to us? Listen to this. This is so crazy simple. While you are still living, breathing, and alive, you have the opportunity to accept salvation that God is offering. You have that opportunity to accept it. You can reject it, and most people will. Most people will reject the simple truth. Remember, we opened up talking about baptism. They'll reject simple truth in favor of complicated lies that make them feel good. I'll tell you what, I feel a whole lot better about believing and knowing the truth today than I did 6 years ago. I'm just saying. So in John chapter 11, what do you reckon Jesus meant when he was talking with Martha about Lazarus? And he says in their conversation, your brother will rise again, in verse 23 of John 11. So Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Do you think Martha expected the resurrection to take place thousands of years in the future? If Jesus taught all of his disciples that it was going to happen in their lifetime, the disciples, many of them became apostles. Listen to this. They were teaching that it was going to happen in their lifetime. Do you suppose Martha got a different picture? I don't think so. Anyway, verse 25, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. This is this is the fulfillment. We live in the fulfillment of what Jesus was teaching in his earthly ministry. And he said, listen, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me, listen to this, will never die. I'm telling you, that is one of the most powerful truths I have ever learned. I'm not going to stop teaching it. Jesus taught it. The apostles taught it. The brethren obviously believed it in the first century because they were, many of them, guided by the Holy Spirit. They were sealed in the Spirit unto the day of redemption. That was when the Lord came. If you think that's for us, you're going to have to show me some miracles. Now, that's pretty much it. Oh, I wanted to show you Revelation 20 real quick. So let's do this. This is how I know that you go to heaven when you die today. Revelation chapter 20. And in verse 5, we'll just start there. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. The 1,000 years had to be completed. This is just that transition period in the first century, about 40 years. And he says, when it's completed, this is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power. What's the second death? Let's keep reading. But they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison, will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth. That's Matthew 24, by the way. Gog and Magog to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came upon the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and devoured them. The destruction of Jerusalem. What's the beloved city? It's not New York. Definitely not Chicago or San Francisco or even Paris, France. It's Jerusalem. This has already taken place. Jesus said it would never happen again. Isaiah 24 and 25 I think, says it will never be rebuilt. It's only happened one time. It's in our past. And at that time when Jerusalem was destroyed, listen to this, verse 10, Revelation 20. We've set the time When does all of this take place? And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So the beast and the false prophet are in this lake of fire, being tormented for day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne of him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. This earth and heaven is this old covenant. I wish we had time to go through this, but we don't. But just look at Deuteronomy 20:21. It illustrates that heaven and earth is the law of Moses. Anyway, and I saw the dead, the great and the small, and there's a lot more other than Deuteronomy 21, standing before the throne, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them. When does death and Hades give up the dead which are in them? At the time that this camp of the saints, or the beloved city, is surrounded and destroyed. I didn't write it. I'm just reading it. It's so obvious. And they were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. So death and Hades can't still exist after it was thrown into the lake of fire. Once it was emptied, it was destroyed and thrown into the lake of fire. This is when judgment took place. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. There it is. That, in a nutshell, and there's a whole lot more, is what judgment is still. Judgment goes on today, but there's not the day of judgment. It's already occurred. And it was a great event, and it marked when salvation came fully. Heaven was opened. Think about it like this. Matthew 16:18. Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, it's not hell, it's Hades. Look it up. The gates of Hades shall not prevail against my church. Once the church was established, which we believe and teach that it was on the day of not on the day of Pentecost, but at the coming of the Lord. It's in its fullness, its completeness, its maturity. Remember Matthew 13, the parable of the mustard seed? It starts small, then it grows big. When it grows mature, then the birds can come and find refuge. That's what happened. So when the church was established on the day of Pentecost, essentially, the kingdom was growing. It wasn't fully mature. But when it became fully mature, then you can come and rest in it. You get to come and rest in heaven, right? That's the illustration of this, 2 verses in Matthew 13. It's so simple and so beautiful. Thank you, Holger, by the way. And that's the way all this works. Okay, so there you go. I'm just going to go ahead and quit. I'm going to end this abruptly after, how long? An hour and 23 minutes. So it's a little better. I thought it was an hour and 25 minutes. I got started 2 minutes late. Well, anyway, thank you all so much. Now, listen to this. I'm going to start advertising, maybe in the little ticker below the screen or something. I got to figure this out. Not great with computers. But I want you to know there are a lot of believers out there. And in the Church of Christ, there are a lot of churches of Christ that believe. So, believe the truth. So, you might think, oh, there's just one in Indianapolis. That is not the case. They're all over the globe. So, I'm going to try to spotlight these guys on a weekly basis so that you know that there are places out there that you can go and visit if you're close to these. And let me say this. If you need us to come to your town and plant a congregation, let me know. We will figure out a way to do this. I have no idea how to do it, but it'll be done. I mean, financially and all that stuff. Hey, we'll figure out a way to do this because this is all about spreading the truth and spreading the gospel. And there are people out there who want to hear the truth. Believe me, there's a bunch of them. I deal with them a lot every week. So there you go. You got my information, my contact information. And I want to say one last thing. Listen, you can find faith in prophecy. And you can have faith in prophecy. You just think about that. Outside of that, I love each and every one of you. We'll see you again next week, same time, 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, right here. Also on Restoration Movement 2.0 on YouTube. So go there and comment and subscribe there on YouTube as well. That's all I got. I will see you all next time around. Love each and every one of you, and just praying for the best for all of us. Hey, this is all about salvation. It's all it boils down to. We'll see you next time.